Is karma real? This mother's Ramzan pain will make you believe. When the holy month of Ramzan knocked, darkness entered instead of light. As the sacred month of Ramzan approaches, people usually look forward to moments of reunion, acts of compassion spreading like fragrance, and sacred verses echoing in reverence beneath the dim glow of oil lamps. But for an elderly mother named Salima, affectionately known in the village as Ammi Jaan, that Ramzan brought not divine light, but an unexpected collapse into darkness. She wasn't just forgotten, she was abandoned. By the very children who once drank from her nurturing breast, and by the daughters-in-law she loved as if they were her own. What could drive a devoted mother, once the heart of a loving household, to be cast out under the blazing sun at the very beginning of the holy month? Does a mother's love expire when wedding vows are exchanged? Or does karma sometimes arrive not in the next life but here, now? This story is a bitter tragedy, but also a tear-stained awakening, a cautionary tale about ingratitude, forgiveness, and the silent, unwavering strength of compassion when humanity seems lost. Salima, the old mother who lived in the large central house of the village, had once been a refuge for many. She wasn't a scholar or a wealthy woman, but she possessed something far rarer, a heart as vast as the ocean. If someone was hungry, she shared her food. If someone was lost, she comforted them. If families broke apart, she stitched them back together with words sweet as honey. Her 6 sons Shahid, Rashid, Salman, Harun, Faiz, and Tariq were her life's devotion. Children she once held through feverish nights, for whom she often went hungry so they could eat. One by one, they married. Ammi Jaan celebrated each union with joy, cherishing each daughter-in-law as if she were her own daughter. The best room went to the eldest bride, fresh coats of paint for the next. She never distinguished between sons and daughters-in-law. She believed love would grow like a rice field, more family meant more laughter. But the first cracks began in silence. Whispers turned into cold words, and warmth gave way to walls. When had her presence in the kitchen become a nuisance? When did her gentle reminders turn into accusations of being too much? When did a mother become a burden? What she didn't realize was that the respect she once held across the village no longer existed within her own home. At first, she thought it was just the awkwardness of newlyweds. Then she blamed her aging mind and body. Until one day, bedridden with fever, she pleaded with her youngest daughter-in-law for a glass of water and was met with irritation and steel-like words. "If you're so sick, why don't you ask your sons to hire a maid?" That was the day she realized she had become a weight in the very house she helped build. The worst pain is not hunger, it's being forgotten while still alive. Every rude word, every cold glance stabbed deeper than any illness. And as Ramzan arrived, when hearts are supposed to soften, her own heart faced a drought of love. But this story isn't just a sequence of cruelty. It holds a turning point when karma speaks loud enough to shake even stone hearts. Sometimes, only fire reveals the darkness we've sown. And when the one who caused pain is suddenly consumed by a greater suffering, can forgiveness still be given? This isn't just a tale of a mother-in-law mistreated. It's a mirror to our conscience. Even the warmest homes may hide sobs no one hears. If you've ever made your mother skip a meal because of your indifference, stay. Watch this story through to the end. You may find yourself in one of the daughters-in-law. Or worse, in the son who turned his face away. No one expected that a spacious home could become a suffocating cage where a mother wasn't allowed to be tired, or cared for, or interrupt her daughters-in-law's private lives. Her silver hair, once a symbol of wisdom and pride, had become a mark of inconvenience, an unwanted remnant of a bygone era. That Ramzan began with quiet hope. Despite her weakness, Ammi Jaan still rose to prepare suhoor, the pre-dawn meal, hoping the sacred rituals might wash away her sorrow. She sat alone in the dark kitchen, the dim light casting shadows across her wrinkled face. One hand peeled dates, the other stifled coughs. No one joined her. No one asked if she needed help. From the center of the family, she had become a ghost. The mockery hurt more than the solitude. Why bother fasting at your age? You'll just get sick and expect us to serve you again. They didn't understand, or didn't want to, that Ramzan wasn't about abstaining from food. For her, it was about cleansing the soul, clinging to the last thread of dignity. Every small act, however frail, was saturated with faith. But the tests kept coming. The same family she once nurtured now delayed meals, knowing she was waiting. One day, her suhoor was a handful of cold rice eaten in silence. For after the evening meal she'd sneak leftover bread or salty soup too harsh to swallow. And yet, she never complained. Her eyes even glowed brighter when she prayed. Not from health but from acceptance. She knew this was a divine test, not punishment, but a measure of her endurance. As a Zen master once said, "Some suffering exists not to destroy, but to awaken." That truth rang in my mind as I thought of Ammi Jaan, too old to chant scriptures, yet meditating in silence through every sigh. Her suffering itself was a form of worship. Still, her own family didn't see it. Her grandchildren, who should have snuggled in her lap, were dumped on her as distractions. One cried, another screamed while she knelt in prayer. The mothers didn't care. "You're old, you can play with them. We're exhausted. If you're fasting, learn to endure." These words dripped acid on a heart already cracking. No one remembered the nights she nursed their fevers. No one cared that she stitched handkerchiefs for weddings or cooked sweet dishes from scratch. Then came the final blow. One sweltering afternoon, while resting from dizziness caused by fasting, her eldest daughter-in-law barged in. "Who do you think you are? I'm the only one doing anything in this house, and you just sit there praying like a saint." "I can help a little." "I'll try," Ammi Jaan whispered. But before the sentence finished, the woman grabbed her wrist and dragged her into the scorching kitchen. She trembled while stirring the pot. Her headscarf drenched in sweat, vision blurred. "Faster. You're not done yet." And then, she collapsed. A quiet sound, but one that should have thundered in the ears of anyone with a heart. No one rushed to help. The daughter-in-law watched her fall, gasping, then coldly dragged her to the door like broken furniture. What happens when a mother is thrown from her own home? Will she perish alone under the Ramzan sun? Or will the divine respond? The answer will leave you speechless. The midday sun scorched everything in its path. At the doorstep of what was once her sanctuary, Ammi Jaan was dumped without a word. She turned once to look inside the home of her memories, her dreams. The door closed behind her with a quiet but merciless finality. She sat on the burning ground, shielding her eyes from the sun and her heart from the shame crushing her chest. This wasn't anger, it was pure, aching loneliness. No elder deserves this. No mother who raised children with love should be discarded like a beggar. But she no longer asked why. No answer would come. "Ya Allah," she whispered, voice so faint the wind didn't carry it. "If I am wrong, forgive me. But if I'm innocent, bear witness." It wasn't a curse. It was a crushed heart still clinging to faith. She didn't pray for revenge just to see hearts change. And then it happened. Minutes after casting her out, the daughter-in-law walked back into the kitchen unbothered. But fate has its timing. A slippery tile. A bowl of hot oil. A split second. She slipped. Fell. Right onto the sizzling pan. Screams ripped through the house. Everyone rushed out, the sister-in-law still applying lotion, the husband glued to his phone. Silence hit like a brick when they saw the woman writhing on the floor, her skin blistered, burned beyond recognition. The husband froze. No longer the cold, dismissive son, he was now a man facing the horror of what had been done. At the hospital, the doctor spoke the words that shattered everything. "We'll try to save her, but her face will never be the same. A life disfigured. Not just by fire but by the cruelty she once inflicted." As the painkillers set in and memory replaced sensation, visions flooded her mind. Ammi Jaan collapsing. Reaching for water. Cast out into the sun. She cried. For the first time, truly cried. "Find her," she begged her husband. "I want to beg for her forgiveness. Allah has punished me. I was wrong." Beneath the dead tree, a body lay still. Meanwhile, outside the village beneath the sparse shade of a withered tree, a frail figure lay motionless. Flies buzzed around her eyes. The sun continued to beat down mercilessly on her wrinkled skin, but no sweat glistened. Her body no longer had enough moisture left to sweat. How long had she been there? An hour? 2. Maybe more. But the most terrifying thing was, no one knew. And the question that now echoed through the hearts of those scrambling to search for her was this: if she dies, who will be able to forgive us? While the eldest daughter-in-law writhed in the recovery ward, her face disfigured, her eyes hollow, her confession pierced through the silence like a blade. "I was the one who threw her out. I dragged her. I shoved her outside. I am guilty. Allah has already punished me, but how do I earn her forgiveness?" In that moment, the entire house trembled, not from fire, but from the earthquake shaking their collective conscience. One by one, the others stood frozen. The younger daughters-in-law who once only watched in silence. The sons, once proud to call her their rock, now reduced to puppets in their wives' hands, all stared in horror. A suffocating silence engulfed the room, as if time had stopped in fear. Fear of what? Fear that they had killed their mother. Not with a knife, not with poison, but with silence, with apathy, with each indifferent glance stretched over months and years. As the truth spilled from the daughter-in-law's lips, the son seemed to awaken from a trance. The eldest, Shahid, turned ghostly pale. He stammered, "Where is mother? Where is she now?" No one knew. No one had watched her leave after she was cast out. No one remembered that it was midday during Ramzan, that the sun could melt asphalt, let alone an elderly body that hadn't eaten suhoor or had a single sip of water for hours. And thus began a desperate race, not against time, but against their own guilt. Shahid, Rashid, Faiz, Tariq, they were no longer grown men in that moment. They became the little boys who once ran to their mother's call, who hid behind her when frightened. But this time, they didn't know where to run back to. They didn't know where she was. They rushed into the alleyways, shouting her name like madmen. "Ammi Jaan." Their cries echoed past bamboo fences and mossy walls. But no voice answered. Only the wind howled, and the sun sliced down like a blade. Then, a trembling neighbor whispered, "I saw her walking toward the fields, she didn't look steady." In a frenzy, they bolted toward the fields. The once proud daughters-in-law trampled through the mud. Skirts hitched high, faces streaked with dirt, no makeup, no dignity left, only panic, shame, and fear. And then, they saw her. Under the faint shadow of a lifeless tree, that small, fragile body lay curled like a child. Eyes closed, lips cracked, clothes wrinkled, arms limp. One hand still raised toward the sky, or perhaps toward the children who had never turned back. Ammi Jaan. The scream shattered the afternoon stillness. Shahid dropped to his knees, cradling her head in his lap. That head, once filled with scoldings, stories, and sleepless prayers, now felt weightless, lifeless. He couldn't believe it. This was the same mother who once stayed up all night nursing him through fever. Now she lay in the dust like a homeless beggar. "We're here, Mother, please forgive us," he sobbed, but she didn't answer. Her eyes remained shut. Breathing. Barely faint, shallow. The youngest son sprinted back to the village for help. They carried her to the clinic as if holding a glass figure about to shatter, hands trembling, hearts racing, souls crushed. The doctor examined her, then said just one line. "If you had arrived 30 minutes later, she wouldn't have survived." The emergency room fell silent. No one dared to breathe. Tears streamed silently down the faces of children who once believed there was still time to repay her love. But fate waits for no one. Hours later, when she slowly regained consciousness, she didn't open her eyes immediately. Her voice, however, was a faint whisper. "Is anyone here?" Shahid held her frail hand tightly. "Mother, it's me, please forgive us." Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy, tired, but still soft with warmth. No anger. No blame. No questions. Only one quiet sentence. "Allah, let me live, to see my children come back." In that instant, no one could hold back their tears. And more miraculous still, she didn't ask what had happened, who had thrown her out, who had stayed silent. She only said, "Don't let this happen to anyone else." Her heart, even after all this, was still as vast as the ocean. As if pain had become a vessel carrying her to enlightenment. But she wasn't done yet. She had one final request. A journey no one expected. A visit no one could have imagined. A soft breeze rustled through the hospital window. On a plain bed, Ammi Jaan breathed heavily, not from physical pain, but from a heart trying to hold on to dreams not yet extinguished. The room was still, except for the beeping monitor and the tear-filled eyes of her children waiting for her words. Then, she spoke, her voice barely above a sigh, yet sharp enough to pierce every soul present. "Take me, to see my eldest daughter-in-law." The room froze. Silence fell like a stone. No one expected the woman who had just been left to die under the burning sun, dragged like a sack, to ask for her tormentor. She didn't ask who had done it. She didn't need names. A mother's heart knows where each wound comes from. She didn't want justice. She just wanted to see her, one more time. Shahid nodded, choked with emotion. They prepared a wheelchair, and as they rolled her down the hallway, the sound of its wheels echoed like drum beats of judgment across the family's conscience. In the special care unit, the eldest daughter-in-law lay wrapped in gauze. The once flawless face now covered in burns. One eye swollen shut. Right hand immobile under thick bandages. She was no longer the proud matriarch of the household, just a fragile being facing the consequences of her own actions. As the door creaked open, her eyes met Ammi Jaan's. Every ounce of strength left her. She broke into sobs. Tears soaked the bandages. With the last of her strength, she whispered, "Ammi Jaan, I was wrong. Please forgive me. Allah has already punished me. I don't expect anything, only that you don't hate me." The room seemed to stop breathing. The frail, silver-haired mother looked at her daughter-in-law for a long moment. Then slowly raised her trembling hand. Not to strike. Not to push away. But to gently rest it upon her head. Just like she used to comfort her sons during fevers. "I forgive you." Those 4 words landed like feathers but weighed heavier than stone. This was not ordinary forgiveness. It was mercy from a soul that had been crushed, yet chose compassion over revenge. It was the grace of a mother who understood that only forgiveness can truly redeem us all. The daughter-in-law sobbed harder. She reached to hold the old woman's hand but trembled too much to grasp it. And yet, Ammi Jaan didn't pull away. She looked at her daughter-in-law not with bitterness, but with the gaze of someone who had passed through pain and returned with a heart that could no longer be wounded. She turned to her children. All stood with heads bowed, like guilty school children before their teacher. Those who once said, "It's not my problem," now knew that silence had been the sharpest weapon of all. "My children," she said gently, "don't let me live just to witness this again. If Allah gives me more time on this earth, it's not for revenge, it's to teach you one last lesson. Forgiveness is strength, not weakness. And as children, never wait until your parents fall before you lift them." In that moment, there were no adults. Only lost children rediscovering what it means to be human. Since that day, the house was never the same again. From that day on, the house changed. Gone were the scornful glances, the cold silence when Ammi Jaan entered the kitchen. Instead, each morning, the daughters-in-law competed to prepare her meals. The sons took turns escorting her to medical checkups. And the grandchildren once tossed to her as an excuse now came running to her with innocent joy, asking for stories, for hugs, for love. Yet on the mother's face, there remained a shadow of sadness like a scar on the soul that never truly heals. She did not hold grudges. She did not hate. But she could not forget. Not to relieve the pain but to remind them that love is not something to be taken for granted. It is something to be protected, with deep gratitude. As for the eldest daughter-in-law, she now lived quietly in the shadow of her scars. She no longer walked the streets with confidence. But sometimes, from the small window of her room, one could glimpse a flickering candle. There she sat, face hidden behind a veil, lips moving silently, not asking forgiveness from her mother-in-law, but from herself. Because some mistakes, no punishment is harsher than the one delivered by your own conscience. Ramzan passed in a strange silence. No more arguments among the daughters-in-law. No more scenes of Ammi Jaan silently going hungry in the kitchen. A house once filled with bitterness and disrespect had now become a place of prayer, each breath laced with remorse. But was a month of repentance enough to erase the wounds etched into a mother's heart? Ammi Jaan never said. She never retold the story of being starved, humiliated, or thrown out of her own home. She only sighed now and then, sitting quietly by the window, gazing out at the fields where she once collapsed like the last leaf of a dying season. But the others could not forget. The youngest daughter-in-law, who once ignored her fevered pleas, now served her with tender care. She was the first to wake each morning, no longer curled in blankets scrolling her phone. She quietly washed her mother-in-law's feet in warm water, rubbed oil on her bony legs, her eyes brimming with tears, not to atone, but to reclaim her humanity. The second daughter-in-law, who had once hidden suhoor food, oversalted the soup, and mocked her during prayers, was now the first to speak up if anyone raised their voice at Ammi Jaan. Each time she coughed, this daughter-in-law was the first to bring water, medicine, and comfort. Faiz, the third son, who once turned away in silence, now came every evening to read Quran beside her in a trembling voice, as if trying to reconnect with the sacredness he'd forgotten under the weight of worldly life. And the eldest daughter-in-law, the one who had dragged Ammi out of the house, now lived in a quiet, inward world. Her face permanently altered by burns, but what tormented her most was not how others saw her but how she saw herself. "This is the face I deserve," she once told a doctor who offered reconstructive surgery. "I don't want to change it. It's the face of my guilt." Each day, she spent hours on a prayer mat in a small back room. Eyes closed, hands clasped, lips whispering apologies that could never be enough. She didn't enter the courtyard, didn't touch anyone. She simply existed, breathing, observing, grieving, with her eyes always searching for signs of her mother-in-law's forgiveness. One day, Ammi Jaan quietly entered the room. The daughter-in-law looked up, eyes flooded with tears. "Mother, if you want to slap me, yell at me. I'll accept it." Ammi Jaan placed her hand on her head, just like before. "I won't hurt you," she said, her eyes welling with emotion. "Because you've already suffered. Now you must live to understand. And if you truly understand, don't let another soul suffer what I did." Those words haunted everyone present that day. From the outside, no one understood what had happened. To outsiders, the transformation was mysterious. A once busy household was now modest. A once glamorous woman now always veiled her face. And an elderly mother, still living, still praying, still shopping for vegetables, but with a quietness that seemed to have given all her emotions to God. One day, a young woman from the village came to see Ammi Jaan, tears falling. "My mother-in-law also scolds me. I've thought of leaving, just like you were once driven out. But then I remembered your story, and I couldn't. I'm afraid I'll become like the one who once hurt you." Ammi Jaan placed her hand on her head, softly. "No one is born good. And no one is evil forever. But if you don't stop at the right time, you'll destroy yourself." Those weren't the words of a scholar or a preacher. But they were soaked in wisdom. From that day on, people began calling her the mother of the village. Not just because she bore 6 sons, but because she embodied patience, forgiveness, and salvation in a world where human kindness is growing fragile like morning dew. But even she knew, despite the respect, despite the change at home, some wounds never heal. Midday dreams still came to her, memories of being dragged out, lying in the burning sand, children turning their backs. These dreams did not make her bitter, they strengthened her resolve to keep living. So that someone, somewhere, could see her, and not repeat the same tragedy. Perhaps this mother was living proof of a painful truth. Not everyone who gives receives in return. But if you still choose to give knowing you might never receive, then you have touched a higher plane of the human spirit, where pain is no longer a burden, but a bridge to compassion, clarity, and closeness to God. Many thought the story ended with forgiveness. The mother forgave. The daughter-in-law repented. The family was reunited. But in truth, when a person has been deeply wounded, peace is not the end. It is the beginning of a long journey to healing. No one said it aloud. But during family meals, Ammi Jaan sometimes sat in silence, her eyes lingering somewhere beyond the dinner table. Perhaps remembering lonely iftars, with only stale bread and her own tears. Or that blazing afternoon, sand burning her back, sky merciless above. It was an invisible crack unseen by others, but forever lodged like a thorn in her heart. The family began to notice. Though she had forgiven them, no one dared say the pain was gone. Because every gentle gesture they now gave her didn't come from obligation but from a deep, unshakable guilt. One night, Harun the fourth son sat alone with his mother in the backyard, where she often lit an oil lamp and counted prayer beads. His voice trembled. "Mother, we love you. Truly. But, we've failed you. Do you still believe in our love?" She didn't reply at once. Instead, she looked up at the Ramzan moon still round and glowing. Then she whispered, "I believe you. But don't wait until your mother is dying to remember your love. I've forgiven you. But time won't give back what you've lost." Harun broke down. Those words didn't bleed, but they burned all the same. The eldest daughter-in-law lived between repentance and redemption. Since their reunion, she hadn't left her room for months. At every prayer time, she knelt cleansing not just her sins, but a shame too deep to name. One night, she sat silently outside Ammi Jaan's door, afraid to knock. Inside, the mother read the Quran in a soft, calming voice. From outside, the daughter-in-law whispered, "Mother, if I asked you to talk to me every day, would you say yes? I fear silence. In silence, I see the worst of myself." There was a pause. Then the door creaked open. The light cast over her scarred face. The burns had faded, but their mark remained. There was no pride left in her eyes. Only ashes ready to melt in the warmth of forgiveness. "Every day," Ammi Jaan said. "But not for you to punish yourself. For you to learn how to live, without fearing you're unworthy." "But I am a bad person, Mother." "No. You did a bad thing. A bad person is someone who never regrets, never changes. But you've cried. You've suffered. And you want to be better. That's what I needed to see." The daughter-in-law burst into sobs. And for the first time in months, she hugged her mother-in-law. Not as a daughter-in-law, but as a child, seeking a mother's love. A love that, somehow, despite everything, was still there. The family had changed for good. The sons stopped being just financial providers. They learned to cook, to care, to converse. They no longer dumped responsibilities on their wives. They understood if a man can't protect his mother, his success in the world is hollow. And for the first time in years, the family began gathering every Friday not to argue, not to boast, but to remind each other of one thing. Never repeat the mistakes of the past. Ammi Jaan never tried to be a saint. She didn't flaunt her pain. But her forgiveness changed the home. Not out of fear of divine punishment, but because they realized to live without gratitude is to destroy your own soul. One September afternoon, after Ramzan. One quiet afternoon in September, after the month of Ramzan had passed, Ammi Jaan sat in the courtyard, gently rocking her newborn grandchild in her arms. Her eyes were closed, her lips whispering familiar verses of prayer. The baby reached out, its tiny fingers brushing against her wrinkled cheek. And she smiled a smile the entire household hadn't seen in a very long time. One daughter-in-law quietly nudged another and whispered, "Do you see? She's smiling." "Yes," the other replied, her eyes misty. "She's truly forgiven us." And perhaps, that's what scared them most. Not the punishment, but the forgiveness they had to live with, while carrying the memory of having hurt someone who had only ever shown them love. Time drifted like a quiet stream through the village. That year's Ramzan had passed, leaving behind scars that would never fully fade, but it had also opened a new door, where faith, remorse, and compassion were slowly rebuilt from ashes. Though weakened, Ammi Jaan refused to live like an invalid. She didn't want pity. She only wanted respect not in words, but in actions. Each morning, she rose early, sat by the front steps with her prayer beads, slowly stroking her silver hair. The children often ran up to her, circling her feet, one hugging her neck, another resting their head in her lap. She smiled at them all, but her eyes lingered longer on the daughters-in-law working quietly in the kitchen. She didn't hold blame. But she no longer held expectations either. One day, an old friend asked her, "Ammi Jaan, have you truly forgiven them?" "Nothing left inside." She answered after a long pause. "Forgiving is easy, forgetting is hard. But if I don't forgive, I only hurt myself. As for forgetting, leave that to Allah." That answer stayed with them. During the annual ancestral feast, the entire family gathered. Every dish was carefully prepared, no one dared be careless. Before the meal began, everyone insisted that Ammi Jaan sit at the head of the table. She looked around, faces once familiar in silent memories now glowed with a kind of overdue, but sincere, remorse. A young grandson, only 8, tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Grandma, is it true that Mom used to be mean to you?" The table fell silent. The eldest daughter-in-law, though her face had healed somewhat, froze, her spoon slipping from her hand. No one could lift their heads. Ammi Jaan leaned down and gently patted the boy's head. "Yes, dear. But I've forgiven her just like Allah forgives us." The boy blinked, confused. "So, do you forget too?" She looked far into the distance. "I don't need to forget. I remember, so I can teach others not to do the same." At that moment, it no longer felt like a meal, it felt like a spiritual cleansing for the entire family. A moment of truth where no one hid, and every wound was named, so it could begin to heal. A quiet moment with her youngest son. One day, her youngest son Tariq sat beside her as she watered the jasmine plants outside. He took her hand trembling like a child and said, "Mother, I'm scared that one day you'll leave us, still carrying pain." She placed her hand on his shoulder. "No, my son. I carry no pain now. I only hope you all live kindly after I'm gone. Don't wait until I'm no longer here to realize how much I mattered." Tariq broke down. Her words pierced like silent arrows. And not just for him, for all her sons, rich or poor, distant or silent, they all knew then, they had once sacrificed something sacred in pursuit of the trivial. The Ammi's Lantern Ramadan Club. In the village, a group of children started a small club called the Ammi's Lantern Ramadan Club. Their motto, anyone who helped their elders, obeyed their parents, and spoke gently to old people would have their name written in Allah's golden book. When asked why they named it after Ammi and not someone else, one child beamed. "Because she's the kindest person who's ever lived in our village." When Ammi Jaan heard of it, she simply smiled. But no one saw the tears rolling down her cheeks. Because what she had longed for most was not to be praised or glorified, but simply to be remembered, as someone who was kind. Even in a world that had once been so cruel to her. A crisp autumn day. The first breeze of fall arrived. White jasmine bloomed around the yard. Ammi Jaan sat at the doorway, holding her old Quran. She closed her eyes and exhaled deeply, as though her entire life had been folded into that single breath. She didn't know how much longer she had. But what mattered more? She knew she had lived enough. Lived to love. To forgive. To endure. To fall. And rise again. Not to be repaid. But to ensure she didn't die holding on to resentment. That was how a mother chose to end her life. Not with a will. Not with riches. But with one legacy only. Compassion. That autumn, the village seemed the same. But to those who had witnessed the tragedy of Ammi Jaan, who had heard the sighs she never said aloud, everything had changed. In every corner, in every glance, in every whisper, people began to pass along her story, the story of a mother who never cursed, even when she was cast out by the very children she gave birth to. At village meetings, her name wasn't spoken with pomp or turned into a symbol. But whenever someone mistreated their mother-in-law, or a child yelled at their parents, an elder would quietly say, "Do you want your home to end up like Ammi Jaan's?" And silence would fall. The weight of a living example doesn't need sermons or scolding. Just presence. For her own family, change no longer came from shock but from habits. The eldest son, Shahid, once busy with business, began spending every Sunday with his mother. They spoke of simple things, the market, the rain, the rice fields. No longer a man hardened by ambition, he had become once again the boy whose mother once washed his hair with lemon water in the courtyard. Tariq, the youngest, changed the most. From a traditional, distant husband, he began washing dishes, cooking, changing diapers, not because anyone forced him, but because he understood, if he didn't change, he'd repeat the same cycle of abandonment where the mother is forgotten, the father is absent, and children grow up cold. But most remarkable, was the eldest daughter-in-law. She no longer attended parties. She didn't go to festivals. But she began writing a journal for herself, for her mother-in-law, and for young brides who would one day enter unfamiliar homes. She wrote, "I used to think I was the center of this house. But Allah showed me, a mother even old, frail, and silent is the true pillar. Not because she commands, but because she endures. Not because she's clever, but because she forgives." She never showed it to anyone. But one day, Ammi Jaan quietly came across the journal, gently closed it, and placed it on the shelf without saying a word. That evening, she asked her children to cook an extra dish, her daughter-in-law's favorite, coconut chicken curry, the one she had eaten 3 bowls of on her wedding day. One cold night, as the weather turned chilly, the family gathered around the fire. The kids chatted about school, the adults sipped steaming soup, the air thick with warmth. Ammi Jaan quietly pulled out an old wooden box. Inside were letters, photographs, and a faded land request, an application she had written 15 years earlier, asking for a small piece of land so her grandchildren could have space to play. "This," she said, handing the paper to her youngest son, "is what I leave for you." Everyone froze. "But mother, you're still healthy, why talk about leaving?" Tariq said, choking up. She only smiled. "Because I no longer need anything. I just want you to know, that when I'm gone, you'll still be here. And the only inheritance I leave behind, is kindness. Don't lose it." No one could say another word. No one begged her not to talk about death. Because they all understood. Departure doesn't begin when the heart stops beating, but when the soul has made peace, and is ready to let go. Winter came. And Ammi Jaan grew weaker, quicker than anyone expected. But she didn't take to bed. She still rose early, still prayed, still brewed morning tea for her children even as her hands trembled. One morning, a grandchild asked her, "Grandma, why do you still work when you're so weak?" She gently stroked the child's head. "Because I don't want to live just to be served. I want to live, so I can still give." That was the last time she poured tea with her own hands. A few days later, she fell seriously ill. But no one heard her complain. She simply called each child into her room, one by one. Not to discuss inheritance. Not to leave behind heavy parting words. Just to say, "I know, you've changed. And I thank you for that." When it was the eldest daughter-in-law's turn, Ammi held her hand for a long time. The woman cried, burying her face in Ammi's lap like a child afraid of being abandoned. "I know I was wrong. But I don't know how to live, if you're not here." Ammi Jaan whispered. "Then live like I did, forgive, endure, and love, even when others don't deserve it." A cold morning, just as the jasmine blossomed. That's when Ammi Jaan closed her eyes for the last time. No one screamed. Only silence filled the house. Because everyone understood she didn't leave in sorrow. She left in peace. Her tombstone bore no long inscription. Only one line. "The mother who taught us love through how she was treated." After the simple but tearful funeral, the house where Ammi Jaan had once lived felt changed. Not because of the absence of her body, but because of the presence of her spirit, now in everything. The morning kitchen smoke. The jasmine bushes in bloom. The prayer beads hanging at the bedside. And the way people spoke to one another. She no longer existed in form, but lived more powerfully than ever in the consciousness of her children. The morning after her burial, Tariq woke early. He sat outside her room, as if waiting for her to call. "Son, make me some tea." But the door stayed shut. And in that moment, the world shattered again because he realized that voice would never come again. He cried not out of regret, but because he now understood. His mother had lived her whole life for her children, keeping nothing for herself. She was the last of a generation that lived by duty, by gratitude, by heart. The first family meal after her passing. No one dared sit in Ammi Jaan's place. Finally, the eldest granddaughter, only 12, meekly asked, "Can we put Grandma's photo at the head of the table?" Everyone nodded. And from that day on, her picture remained there, a silent reminder that the one who gave them everything, was still watching how they chose to live. Time passed. A year later, the village held a memorial for her. No invitations were sent. No banners, no pomp. Yet the turnout was astonishing. Young mothers came to share how they'd learned patience from her. Daughters-in-law confessed that after hearing her story, they washed their mother-in-law's feet for the first time in their lives. Children read poems fumbling, innocent words. "Grandma Ammi wasn't our grandma, but we wish she was." Tariq, the youngest son, stepped forward. In his hands was a leather-bound journal, the diary of the eldest daughter-in-law. He read an entry no one had heard before. "Mother didn't scold me with words. Her silence shamed me more than 1,000 lectures. She never forced me to kneel. But the day I saw her dragged across the floor, I knelt in my heart forever. I hurt her. But she chose to teach me how not to hurt others. And now, I will spend the rest of my life doing what she did. Loving, without expecting anything back." The courtyard fell silent. The wind rustled the tiny flags overhead. The scent of incense and jasmine mingled in the air, as if her spirit were still there. Not judging. Not blaming. Just watching, and smiling. Years later, when the children were grown, they still spoke of a grandmother who had no degrees, no wealth, and left behind no inheritance, but who gave them a standard no one dared betray. Live to love, not to dominate. One granddaughter, now a university lecturer, once asked her mother, "Mom, what if one day, I treat you the way you once treated grandma? Her mother, the eldest daughter-in-law, held her hand, looked her in the eye. Then I'll forgive you. Just like she forgave me. But I hope, you'll never have to. Because you've already learned from her story. That answer, soft as air, made the young woman cry. From family tragedy to living symbol, Ammi Jaan became a living legend. No statues. No books. Just a symbol of silent mothers. Forgotten, but never unloving. She was the small light in a dark home. Not bright enough for the whole village, but enough for her family to find their way back. That Ramzan, people didn't just fast to cleanse their bodies. They lived to purify their hearts. By remembering the woman once cast out in loneliness, but who left behind a sky full of grace when she left. And perhaps, that is how a mother becomes immortal. The room where she lived was left untouched. No one moved anything. The small bed still had the dip where she lay each afternoon. The hand-embroidered pillow had faded with time. And the old wooden prayer beads still rested at her bedside, whispered over by her trembling hands under the glow of an oil lamp. The third daughter-in-law, once the one who oversalted the soup and raised her voice in frustration, was now the first to enter the room each morning. She lit incense, kneeled, and touched the beads as if afraid anyone would forget the presence that had once filled that home. One evening, her daughter Sarah asked, "Mom, why do you touch those beads like they're treasure?" The mother paused, then gently guided her daughter's hand to the prayer beads. Because they were the only place grandma could pour her pain, when no one else wanted to hear her voice. Sarah stared wide-eyed. And in that moment, she began to understand that some pain needs no words. A single touch, a worn-out bead, a fold in an old blanket, can carry the entire story of a mother who suffered in silence. Tarek, once the most clueless of sons, now he began writing down every memory of his mother. Not to publish, not to make a film, but so future grandchildren would know. A mother's love isn't in her words. It's in the quiet sacrifices we didn't notice until she was gone. He wrote about the day she skipped meals so her children could eat. The moment she was cast out of her home and didn't protest. The day she forgave the one who hurt her most. And finally, he wrote, "We once killed our mother's heart with our indifference. But instead of punishing us, she chose to save us, through forgiveness. And that's why she didn't need to live longer. Because she had already given us the greatest gift a person can. A living example." One day, long after they'd grown used to her absence, a grandson asked Tarek, "Uncle, what if I forget grandma someday?" Tarek smiled, placing his hand on the boy's chest. "It's okay. You can forget her face. But if you live like her, she'll still live inside you." The boy nodded solemnly. Then whispered, "I'll never throw my mom out of the house. I promise." The promise was as light as the wind. But to Tarek, it landed heavy on the heart. Because he knew, a promise made by a child, born from tragedy and raised by love, is a promise that never dies. The House of Light. Ammi Jaan's home came to be known as the House of Light by villagers. Not because it was grand or ornate, but because it had once been so dark that it forced everyone to open their eyes. And it became illuminated not by chandeliers, but by the silent sacrifice of a mother. Every Ramzan, the family gathered to read the Quran and share the story once more, not to reopen wounds, but to remember, and to be grateful. The daughters-in-law held hands not as silent rivals anymore, but as companions in guilt. And now, Allies in redemption. We often believe love must be spoken. But Ammi Jaan proved something else. Some kinds of love need no words. They stay, even when rejected. They give, even when nothing is returned. They forgive, even when the other doesn't deserve it. And then people began to wonder. Is there an Ammi Jaan in every home? A mother silently enduring. Keeping the kitchen warm. Preserving peace. And holding each thread of kinship together. While no one notices. If so, don't wait until she's gone to realize. Go hug your mother. Pour her a glass of water. Hold her hand in silence. Because maybe she's not saying it out loud. But she needs you more than anything else. 1 year later, the house was transformed. Not with new paint, furniture, or fancy upgrades. But in spirit. A gentle calm now filled every breath of the household. People lived slower. Fewer harsh words. More silent moments to reflect on right and wrong. No one raised their voice in the kitchen. No one let the elderly wash the dishes. And most importantly, no one let the elders eat last. Tariq, the youngest son, now managed family affairs. But what surprised everyone came one late winter afternoon, when he gathered the family and said, "I think it's time we fulfill something Mom once wished for." They looked at him, confused. He unfolded an old letter, its handwriting shaky and tilted. "If one day I am no longer here, don't do anything extravagant for me. Just go on pilgrimage. Not to pray for my soul, but to revive your own." She had hidden the letter away. Tariq found it only while clearing out an old drawer. So the whole family, from the youngest grandchild, only 5 years old, to the daughter-in-law who once caused her pain, began preparing for a pilgrimage to Mecca. It wasn't called a vacation. It was a journey of repentance. A chance to cleanse not what the mirror reflects, but what no one sees. Neglect. Entitlement. The laziness of loving too late. Upon reaching the Holy Land, no one spoke much. Every step felt heavy with history. But lighter, too, wrapped in divine mercy. Surrounded by millions. Each member of Ammi Jaan's family felt small. Much like they once had under her gaze after hurting her. But this time, they weren't asking for forgiveness. They came to give thanks. Thanks for still being alive to make amends. Thanks for once being loved unconditionally. Thanks for the pain because it had saved them from a hollow life. The eldest daughter-in-law stood before the Kaaba for hours. The desert wind tugged at her veil. Tears streamed beneath it. She clasped her hands, whispering a prayer only Allah could hear. "If you can still hear me, Mother, please see me here. I once dragged you out of your home. Now I walk into this holy place, on the same feet that once betrayed you. And every step is an apology." Tariq, circling the Kaaba, felt something for the first time. The death of ego. He had once denied responsibility. Once let his mother live in the shadow of his wife. But with every step around the Kaaba, only one thought remained. If you suffered without resentment, Mother, then I will live the rest of my life. So you never look down from heaven with sadness again. After the pilgrimage ended, they gathered quietly in a small hotel room. No one spoke for a long time. Then Tariq said softly, "I don't think Mom died." They all turned to him, confused. "I mean, I think she became something more. A reason to live better. A standard to raise our children by." and a voice inside us, every time we're about to do something wrong. No one disagreed. Because truly, though her body was gone, her moral presence filled every corner of their lives. When they returned home, the village welcomed them with new eyes. Word had spread of their pilgrimage not in praise, but in reverence. Many visited Ammi Jaan's grave, not to pray, but simply to sit for a while, as if visiting a teacher who never needed to raise her voice to change the world. An elderly woman, with a cane, whispered, "I once cursed my mother-in-law, but after her story, I never dared again." An old man said quietly, "I once sent my mother back to the village. Now I brought her to live with me, because I remembered Ammi." No one could have predicted it. A frail, forgotten woman cast out by her daughter-in-law changed the hearts of a generation. Inside the family, no one spoke of guilt anymore. They only spoke of the lessons. Whenever someone raised their voice, or tensions ran high, the youngest granddaughter would whisper, "Grandma wouldn't like that." And just like that, the room calmed. One day, Tarek placed her old prayer beads into a glass frame and hung it in the center of the home. Beneath it, he engraved the words, "A mother who didn't teach with words, but turned our mistakes into light through forgiveness." And that was how Ammi Jaan never left. Every Ramzan, her home lit up again. The yard was swept, curtains replaced, walls repainted, and always, a small table stood in the center of the home, with her framed photo, a jasmine plant, and her old prayer beads. No one called it an altar, because they didn't want to remember her as someone who had passed. They remembered her as someone still living within them. The children called it Grandma's Corner, and every suhoor and iftar, the family began their meal with the same words. "We eat under her gaze." One night, under a full Ramzan moon, Tarek stepped into the courtyard, frozen in stillness. The breeze was cool, the jasmine fragrant, and he saw her again, watering plants, gently brushing her hair behind her ear. He knew it was only memory, but somehow, her eyes, her smile, remained as vivid as ever. Inside, the eldest daughter-in-law, once the source of the deepest pain, had become the spiritual heart of the home. She now taught her grandchildren to pray, taught them that fasting wasn't about suffering, but about appreciation. In every story she told, she spoke of Ammi Jaan, not as a victim, but as a hero, who had pulled the family back from the fire they themselves had started. One day, her 10-year-old daughter asked, "Mom, why didn't Grandma stay mad at us until the end?" The mother hugged her tightly. "Because if she had, you wouldn't have a mom to hug like this today. I lost her because of my mistakes, but she gave me a chance to begin again, so I could love you fully." The child didn't understand everything, but she stayed quiet. And from that day on, she never raised her voice at her grandmother again. Ammi Jaan becomes a legend. In time, the village began to speak of Ammi Jaan as a near mythical figure. Her story spread like a living parable. The young men in the upper village, when talking about marriage, reminded each other, "Marry someone who respects your mother first." Daughters preparing to become brides texted their moms, "Mom, if I ever treat you like the ones who hurt Ammi Jaan, please slap me back to my senses." And those who had once been dismissed as burdens, mothers-in-law, were now treated with gentle care. No one dared to brush off tired sighs like, "Mom, I'm exhausted, or Mom, help me. Because deep down, everyone remembered those same words were once spoken to Ammi Jaan, and they had once brought her to her knees under the scorching sun. Her story became a medicine. Not sweet, but healing. No one wanted to drink it again. But no one dared forget. One evening, as the sky turned violet with dusk, Tariq took his nephew to visit his mother's grave. He didn't cry. He simply sat, brushing away wild grass around the headstone, eyes following birds swirling in the sky. The boy asked, "Do you miss Grandma?" Tariq nodded and said, "I don't just miss her. I live so I don't let her down." "What do you mean?" "Every time I feel like yelling at my wife. I remember when someone screamed in her face. Every time I feel like skipping a meal my mom made. I remember when she went hungry all day. And every time I feel tired and want to give up. I remember she lived till her last breath just to keep this family together." The boy stayed silent. Then he squeezed Tariq's hand tightly. "I'll live like Grandma. I promise." That night, the whole family read the Quran together. Each grandchild took turns reciting. The adults didn't sleep before lighting incense and placing a hand gently on her prayer beads. People often say, when someone dies, they're gone. But Ammi Jaan, she was never gone. She became the breath in the courtyard. The story passed down through generations. The moral compass everyone looked to whenever darkness stirred inside them. And ultimately, she became a love that would never run dry. Under the mossy roof of the home that was once her sanctuary, the leaves seemed to fall slower. The Ramzan breeze returned. But this year, there was no old mother quietly fingering prayer beads on the porch. No gentle voice calling from the kitchen before sunrise. "Who's awake for suhoor, children?" And yet, strangely, the house was not cold. Because the memory of her had never dimmed. That year, the whole extended family, 3 generations, sat around a wooden plaque inscribed, "Mother is no longer in the kitchen. But she has lit a fire in every heart." It was the final formal memorial. No more sobbing, no aching sense of loss. Only quiet gratitude. And reverent admiration. Tariq stood and spoke. He, who had changed the most since his mother's passing, now stepped forward to offer the family's closing words. To end the journey of sorrow. And begin a new chapter. A chapter of conscious kindness. "My brothers and sisters." His voice warm, steady. "We made mistakes. But through them, we grew. Mother didn't die to be mourned. She lived, so we could learn how to love each other completely." He turned to her photo. "I know you don't want us stuck in regret, Mom. You want us to live fully, joyfully. So your pain wouldn't be in vain." At that moment, the eldest daughter-in-law, the one who once threw Ammi out, rose. She covered the scarred side of her face. But her eyes were calm, brimming with tears. "I'm not asking for anyone's forgiveness anymore. Because she already forgave me. I only ask one thing. If any of you ever see a mother who's lonely, who's being forgotten, go to her. As if she were Ammi Jaan." The family wept. But not from guilt. From growth. From renewal. From the clarity that comes only after great pain. Time moves on. And people forget the details. They may not remember who first raised their voice. Who stayed silent when she was pushed outside. They may not remember exactly when she forgave each of them. But they will always remember. There once was a mother named Ammi Jaan, who lived with compassion. She never asked for repayment, never needed praise. She only needed to know that the children who once broke her learned how to make things whole again. Her story isn't epic, not mythical, but it will live on, like a whisper in every heart. Because that's how a mother becomes immortal. Not through miracles, but through mercy. The only force powerful enough to undo any wrong. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us, what did this story teach you? How will you carry it forward in your life? Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings us strength, healing, and hope. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support allows us to continue crafting stories that awaken the soul and heal the world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.